Okay, so this post is about trivial magical items. Now, you might at this point be assuming I'm talking about the minor magical items that you see in Tasha's Cauldron or one of those other source books, but no, I'm actually thinking even more trivial than that, like really simple single-use items that don't have a lot of big game impact. Now, your question might be, why would you need that? So, in most D&D games, you need some sort of magic item economy. I mean, you might run a really low fantasy game where there are items, and if you find them, then that's lucky, and there is no real option of selling them, so it's just that's all there is. But in a lot of D&D games, there's an element of being able to buy things in some circumstances and sell them in others. Now, the problem with this is not every town is big enough for an item mart or a Gilmore's Glorious Goods. Some small towns like Phandalin Town in the Phandelver adventure are fairly new and getting set up, and they're not necessarily going to have this big magic item emporium. You might not want the sort of campaign where magic is used like technology is in our world, and where there are shops that you can just buy magic items on tap. And if that's not something you want, then you might find yourself wanting some kind of very low-key magic item economy that's still present. So what I mean by that is you might want a smaller town to have a little magic item shop that sells maybe one or two genuine magical items. So maybe a +1 dagger and a +1 shield. And along with that, you also sell a whole bunch of little trivial pieces that sort of fill out the shelves and add extra to that, add other things that the PCs can buy. Or you might want this town to just have nothing but a herbalist shop. And if they ask about who can I talk to about magic or magic items, they just say, oh, well, you can talk to the herbalist. And they might have nothing of consequence of any permanent power. They might just have a few of these little trivial things that will cost them a couple of gold and maybe be good for 1 to 3 uses, and that's all they have. But if the PCs are looking to sell magic items, this is the place you start, because that's the person who has the contacts you'll need. Now, for a shop like that, most items in the DM's guide are far too upscale. I mean, you're starting with +1 weapons and +1 armor. And even some of the lesser items, the minor items you find in places like Tasha's Cauldron, still have powers that you can use over and over again. They're a permanent item. So even those can be quite significant compared to the sort of thing we're talking about here. So what I'm talking about is items that are just simple, trivial toys for the PCs to buy and maybe to keep in their pockets. When they have a little bit of spare change, they get some of these because they want to get some magical items and this is the best that's on offer, and maybe they just forget about them, or maybe they are things that come in useful just every now and then. They're the right tool for the job. But I'm talking about things like items that are a very low-level spell or a single-use item that replicates the effects of a cantrip. So just some examples I'm thinking of these kind of magical items. You might look at mending oil. Perhaps you have just a little flask of magic oil, and maybe it's good for 3 uses, but it replicates the mending spell. And the mending spell is one of those things that doesn't always get a Guernsey because there are so many other cantrips with more utility and more use. So prestidigitation cleans, but it also does a bunch of other stuff, whereas mending just does one thing. So maybe that's a way to give your PCs access in a very limited way to that cantrip. You might also have a powder that gives food either a really good flavour or a really bad flavour. A good flavour might be something that you sprinkle on your food to make it taste really good, or you might want to be impressing someone who's coming to visit and you use this to dress up the meal you give them. Or there could be some value you have to making food taste dreadful. You might want to spoil something for someone or distract some kind of enemy. So you have this powder that you sprinkle it on and it replicates the effects of certain cantrips that can change the flavour of something. Something that's a bit more high-end, but still quite trivial, a continual flame torch. A torch that has had the continual flame cast on it. That's quite powerful in the sort of items we're talking about. But effectively, it's a wizard spell cast at 2nd level and never has to be cast again. It's permanent. So it could just be cast and forgotten about and sold to a shop, and you now have a torch that never goes out. You might have a chest that keeps food cold, basically a refrigerator chest that replicates the effects of cantrips that can cool food. Or a brush that has the prestidigitation cleaning effect on it. And that might be something that just works on clothing. So you have this brush that you can just dust down clothes and it will effectively use that cantrip to clean them magically. You might have pellets or matches that you can strike and will light a fire. So you use the create bonfire spell, and you might have a limited number, and that's a spell that does actually have a damage to it. So it might be one of those things that in certain circumstances you can pop the pellet and flick it on someone's clothes if you're in an emergency, and that might do some damage. You could also, and this is more of a trivial one than before, but you might have instant tea leaves. You might have little tea leaves that you can sprinkle in water, and it will use a few effects of prestidigitation. It colours it like tea, it flavours it like tea, and it heats it up. So you just sprinkle these tea leaves in and you have an instant cup of warm, tasty tea. You might have a freezing draft that does the shape water spell effect that freezes water in a 5-foot cube. So basically you've got this little tiny flask that you can put a drop in and instantly water turns to a frozen block for an hour. And that's one of those things that it's not necessarily useful in all circumstances, but maybe you have been underwater and you're coming up through a little hatchway trying to escape from a monster, and you drip the draft in and suddenly you've sealed that hatch behind you. It's one of those things that they're useful sometimes. Or maybe you have a version of the good berries spell, because you don't exactly have to follow the spell effects exactly, as long as this is a trivial thing that's not going to break the game. Maybe you have good berries that are good for more than a day. So they might last a week or two, and you can keep them, and they're basically a day's rations, and they give you a hit point if needed. So if someone's down, you can force one into their mouth and get them to bite down on it, and it gives them a hit point back. All these things are not game breaking. They're not going to be having huge effects unless you use them in just the right place at just the right time. But it gives you a collection of items that you can have in magical laboratories, in shops, in just odd little places that can just flesh out what PCs can find. And it gives them just these odd little things that are only situationally useful, but just fill the world out a little bit. So yeah, have a think. What are some very simple spells, either cantrips that might have a temporary effect, like just a 1 or 2 uses, or a flask that has 10, or a very specific use of a cantrip that is permanent but is only useful under certain circumstances? What are some of those items that you could fill your world with that are just very simple little magic items of the everyday sort? So yeah, have a think. Do you have a bunch of ideas that you'd like to put in the chat? Throw some ideas back. Let people reflect on them as they're reading the chat themselves. But do you feel like this is a good idea? Or do you think, no, stick with what's in the book, that's fine? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for listening.